In and out with this is why I
oh, nice.
So yeah, you have a
very nice. That's awesome. Oh, nice. And there's even a whatever the word for it is.
Viewfinder.
Yeah, viewfinder.
So it's a little clunkier to set up than the normal camera, but that's been.
I think it's worth it.
Yeah. I suppose black. Yep.
Well, there's nobody watching.
I'll keep doing it.
Hello everybody, it is 3:30, which of course means it is time for one of our afternoon STEM shows here at the Headwaters Science Center. My name is Ryan, I'm one of the educators here, and I've got a couple things that I want to talk about today. So typically Thursday and Friday, what we do is we do kind of a follow-up talk about whatever book it was that Lee read on Wednesday. Lee's our executive director, and every Wednesday he finds a critter, usually it's the rabbit. Yesterday it happened to be the Junkosaurus out in front of the Science Center, and he reads them a story that he gets from the Bemidji Public Library. And yesterday he found a really interesting book, maybe one of my favorites that he's ever read for these things over the last year, a book called Dinosaur Lady. That's the story of a woman named Mary Onning, who is one of the original... This is kind of what we're going to be talking about today. But she's a very early paleontologist. She lived in southern England in like the early 1800s is mostly when she's operating. She's like I think she's born in the late 1700s, but was doing her work in the like early 1800s. And she ends up being somebody who discovers a lot of really interesting specimens in southern England that end up being very formative as far as kind of the knowledge base for early paleontology, a lot of her discoveries. And this book is in one part about kind of all the different things she discovers and when she's discovering them, but it also touches a little bit on some kind of interesting history points here that kind of reflect on what the state of science was at the time when she was doing her work. And there was a couple pages in particular that I thought were very interesting. And so one of the first like really major discovery is she found the remains of an animal called an Ichthyosaur, which is this big aquatic reptile that existed, in the dinosaur times. And it talks about on this page how the Geological Society of London finds these remains and determines that they think it is actually a like millions of years old specimen, and how that was very controversial at the time because the standard understanding of geology at the time was that the Earth was about 6,000 or so years old, very biblically based. And this is in about, I think it's 1811 is when this is going on, I think is when she finds the Ichthyosaur, so somewhere around that time is when these conversations are starting to happen. And one of the things that I thought was kind of cool about that is, like I said, it's just kind of this one little insight, but it's talking about something that was a much bigger, much longer conversation that was happening, not just in, biology or paleontology, but kind of just like in the world at large at the time. And so the age of the Earth is something that like kind of starting in like the mid 1700s started really coming under some scrutiny. And a lot of it is tied to this idea of extinction. And so for a long time, it was assumed that species could not go extinct. And again, this is tying back to some Christian creationism stuff, where basically the idea was that if an animal were to go extinct, that would imply that it was somehow imperfect, it was flawed in some way. And so an animal going extinct would mean that God had made a mistake when making them. So the idea that an animal going extinct was sort of viewed as heretical because it meant that God was imperfect because he had made a mistake when making this thing. So it was a very controversial thing to say that this animal used to exist and now it doesn't because it was not suitable to continue existing. And so it's interesting because, things like ichthyosaurs, we sort of start getting documented discoveries of these types of things. Like I said, in like the early 1800s, first dinosaur that is like officially designated a dinosaur, I think gets found in the 1820s, so not too long after this. But the kind of prevailing idea at the time was they would find the remains of these animals, and for some of them, like the smaller things, like it talks very early on in the book how when Mary was a little girl, she would go down to the seashore and she would just like pick up things like snake stones and devil's toenails, and these are fossils is what they are. But at the time, what was thought is that they basically were created by the Earth itself. They like generated within the ground. They were just weird rocks. They weren't like the remains of like a long dead animal. And you would occasionally find, remains of animals that were no longer in an area. And at the time, because, so much of the world hadn't been explored at the time, the idea was basically like, yeah, this thing maybe used to live around here, but doesn't anymore, but it still must exist somewhere else. They kind of came up with this idea of like, a thing can never go fully extinct, but it can go locally extinct. The term we would use for that today would be extirpated. No longer exists within an area, but does exist somewhere else. And so it was kind of aided by the fact that they said a lot of the world wasn't well explored by Europeans at the time, that they were like, yeah, we don't have ichthyosaurs anymore, but maybe they live too deep in the ocean for us to find, or maybe they just live in a different part of the world where we haven't found them yet, but they must be out there. And the kind of prevailing sort of background model for species at the time was this thing called the Great Chain of Existence, where, again, it's very biblically based, where the idea is that there is this very structured hierarchy of all the living things in the world. And so you have God at the top, the angels right below that, the humans right below that, all the various animals ranked by whatever criteria below that, and then plants and fungi and fire, and eventually you get down to like rocks and dirt and things like that are at the bottom. And so part of this problem that they were having is that in this chain of existence, kind of part and parcel with it was that if something were to disappear out of that chain, it would be like terrifically catastrophic. Like it would unset the natural order of things. And so things couldn't get extinct because it would like the world would end about it. And so the fact that we still existed was like proof that that nothing had gone extinct. And I think I'm going to keep chatting about this for a little bit here. I'm going to, tell some kind of unique stories that have to do with this. But you also might notice I have in front of me a dinosaur. This is a Spinosaurus. And I have some paints here with me as well. And so we actually have an event coming up here at the Headwaters Science Center where we are going to be doing some painting with these. So if you're interested in doing this, there's a few slots open yet, where basically what it'll be is you'll get a 3D printed Spinosaurus yourself, and then you and however many other people sign up for it. We've got quite a few sign-ups already, actually, but there's still a few slots open. We'll get a 3D printed Spinosaurus that you yourself can paint. One of our other educators, Carl, has kind of taken the lead on it, but he asked me to make an example one because I'm very inexperienced at painting, and he wanted a bad one that would be a good example for people to, if they don't do a great job on theirs, they don't need to feel bad because mine's also bad, kind of thing. But I think we're going to talk a little bit about kind of my rationalization for painting it the way I'm going to end up painting it here. But I'm also going to keep talking about this Marianing and the kind of what the state was of biology at the time that she was kind of doing her work. And so I kind of am still on the fence about what kind of colors I want to use with my Spinosaur. So one of the things that I know about Spinosaurs is that they are kind of a semi-aquatic thing. Like they get their food by going and catching fish. They kind of operated kind of like big alligators, big crocodiles. And so I think one of the things I want to do for my kind of base coat here is I want to kind of model it after a lot of like big aquatic vertebrate predators are. And one of the things you'll see with a lot of these things, and this is true for, alligators and crocodiles, the other thing that it's really obviously true for is things like a lot of sharks, is that you'll see they actually have a light-colored belly and then a darker back. And that's so that if you're below them in the water and you look up, they're harder to see because you're looking up into the light and their light-colored belly camouflages with that. Or if you're looking down at the bottom, you're looking down into the darkness and their back is then covered from that. So I think I'm going to see if I can find a nice kind of light gray color here to do the belly. I think we'll do this one. Like I said, I've honestly never painted with acrylics before. I've never done any miniature painting. So, like I said, this is probably going to be bad, and that's okay. But, going back to our great chain of being, I said it was very much the kind of prevailing model of species for, most of the, call it the Enlightenment period, basically, where you start seeing manifestations of it that happen kind of all throughout, like policy making. Like a lot of colonialism stuff comes out of kind of this idea. And one kind of interesting story that I like to tell kind of in regards to this that I think is a good reflection on how science can influence, actions and policy is Thomas Jefferson's relation to the Great Chain of Being. And so Thomas Jefferson was a big-time believer in the Great Chain of Being. Thomas Jefferson was kind of a scientist first and foremost, and a politician second. He was somebody who was very interested in science, very interested in the natural world. And like I said, he was a big believer in the Great Chain of Being. And so, like I said, what that meant was that he did not believe that animals could go extinct, or plants for that matter. But that becomes a problem when you start finding remains of animals that, like I said, don't exist anymore, or that you've never seen anywhere before. And so something that was kind of interesting that was happening in Europe at the time that the Americas were, kind of getting established, and they were starting to get sort of independence movements rumbling in the Americas from the Europeans who initially colonized them, was there was this big paper, or series of essays, I guess, that came out by this French guy by the name of Buffon. And basically, what Buffon published was this big essay that was all about why the Americas are so small and weak and bad and stupid. And basically what he was looking at is, there's animals that exist in the Americas that also exist over in Europe and Asia, so things like wolves and bears and things like that. And what they noticed is that they were, for the most part, smaller in the Americas than they were over in Europe. And so there was a lot of questions at the time about, okay, why is that? And the prevailing theory was just that, America is, too weird and gross and swampy relative to Europe. And so it's not, fit for strong life to exist in. And, it ends up being a lot of racial stuff with that, because obviously there were people in the Americas when Europeans got here too. And that same rationale was applied to the people as was applied to the animals. But you started seeing even, assertions that, even Europeans who came over would eventually become similarly, weak and dumb. And that was used as a rationalization for continuing to colonize, and refused to grant independence for the colonies when they started asking for it, was that they, weren't suited for it. America, the continent, was not capable of sustaining democracy because of how, like I said, the climate for it was bad, basically. It would made people and animals weak just by virtue of its climate. And Thomas Jefferson was vehemently opposed to this idea because he knew of fossil remains that existed in the Americas, specifically remains of what at the time he called mammoths, we now call them mastodons, the ones he was looking at. But there's probably 40 or so years of Thomas Jefferson's life where he was obsessively hunting for a living mastodon somewhere in the Americas, because he, like I said, his worldview was that animals could not go extinct. Mastodons were not a thing that was known to exist in Europe. And so if they didn't exist in Europe, and they didn't exist in Africa that anyone had seen, they didn't exist in Asia that anyone had seen, they must exist in the Americas. Because basically anywhere west of the Appalachian Mountains really hadn't been explored yet, so they must be out there somewhere. And because they're big, their existence would kind of prove America's suitability for being a Western democracy, basically. And so you have kind of this long litany of encounters that Thomas Jefferson has with this Buffon guy, where he is basically trying to prove to him that America is suitable for democracy, including one incident where he has I think it's James Madison. He has James Madison mail an entire dead moose to France, no preservation or anything for it, so it takes it a year to get there, because they shoot this moose in New Hampshire and in the middle of winter, and it takes it a year for this moose to actually get to Buffon's house, and by the time it gets there, it's not recognizable as anything anymore. But Buffon dies shortly thereafter, and Thomas Jefferson continues being a politician, and of course eventually becomes president. But even when he was president, he was still kind of obsessed with mammoths. It's kind of secretly part of all of his debts that he incurred later in his life was that he was paying for expeditions for people to discover mammoths, and having mammoth teeth and tusks and things mailed to him. One of the more famous instances of, Jefferson's attempts to find mammoths, and you don't hear about it really anymore because it's kind of stupid, to be honest. And obviously a lot of other things came out of this, but the Lewis and Clark expedition was, wasn't their only goal, but it was one of their primary goals. Was they were supposed to find mammoths out in the western part of the country. You hear it now as, the kind of whole Northwest Passage thing, which was part of it from the beginning, but Jefferson had an ulterior motive there in that he believed that they would find living mammoths out there and it would prove that they still existed. Which I just think is kind of funny that, one of our founding fathers, one of the people that, is very highly regarded in his era and, had this fierce commitment, this obsession with finding a thing that wasn't there because, that's what his worldview kind of forced him to do. And I said it, by the mid-1800s, it kind of had become a more mainstream idea that extinction could happen, and the stuff that Mary Yawning was discovering was a big motivator for that discussion finally happening. Another guy who was very prominent in this is another French guy by the name of Cuvier. Did a lot of the initial, groundwork for mainstream acceptance of extinction as a thing that could happen. Charles Lyell is another guy who was very prominent early on. He's a Scottish geologist who is a lot of the times credited as being kind of the originator of old Earth models, saying that the Earth is billions of years old rather than a couple thousand. It's a big, like I said, Charles Lyell gets credited with that a lot, but there was other people that were pushing for the same thing at the same time. And of course, eventually, where it really comes to a head is with Charles Darwin in the 1850s, 1860s, when he publishes On the Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection and Descent of Man, which, is that a Darwin or is that Thomas Huxley that did that one?
Darwin.
It is Darwin?
That one just fits Homo sapiens into the previous theory.
Yeah, because, he, in Origin of Species, Darwin very specifically avoided talking about humans in it because he knew it would be very controversial. And so he published this later work called The Descent of Man after his boy that was in his corner the whole time kind of laid some groundwork for him, went into all the academia spaces and argued on his behalf was this guy named Thomas Huxley who did some of his own publications on it, kind of in between Origin of Species and Descent of Man coming out. Boy, I really made a mess of that one. But Darwin, like I said, knew it was going to be very controversial, this kind of thing, but said it was something that really couldn't be asserted until, there was some level of acceptance for the world being older. And that's just the truth of kind of how evolution has to be understood, is that it needs an old Earth model for it to work. And let's get a little controversial, why not? One of the things that I'll sometimes hear people talk about when I'm talking about evolution with people here at the Science Center or out in my everyday life, one of the kind of common things you'll hear people say who are, kind of in the creationist camp of things, is they'll talk about how they believe in what they call microevolution and not macroevolution. This is indistinguishable from the black that this primer is, but whatever, we'll keep going. And I always think that's kind of an interesting position to have, because it kind of speaks to not really understanding how natural selection and evolution by natural selection works. Is basically, there really isn't just a thing that is macroevolution and microevolution. There's no way to really separate those two things, because macroevolution is just microevolution that is
on a geologic time scale,
built up over time.
Yeah.
you know, macroevolution doesn't happen in a single instance. It's microevolution over a long period of time. And so the people who come to me and say, you know, I believe in microevolution but not macroevolution, you know, what they're really saying is, I believe in macroevolution, but I don't believe the Earth has been around long enough for it to happen, is the way I have to interpret it to keep it, you know, intellectually coherent. But that's oftentimes not what they really mean. I don't know. I think that's kind of a interesting way to think about things is, you know, like I said, it's a lot of times it's just a matter of time span.
There are certainly intersections between beliefs and scientific findings, and they can sort of conflict with each other, and that can be tough, definitely.
Yeah, one of the, kind of going back to Earth Age things, one of the preeminent theories as far as like how geology happened, like how like morphology of the Earth occurred for a long time, was there was an assumption that it was like a handful of like really catastrophic events that kind of formed everything on Earth. And we were kind of past the era of catastrophes. Like, this is stuff that like happened in biblical times, that, you know, the Earth was formed by this series of big catastrophic events, and now it's over. And we still have like earthquakes and volcanoes and stuff like that happen every once in a while, but, you know, the Earth is what the Earth is, and it's always been that way, other than, you know, a little volcano that happens every once in a while. And so I mentioned a guy by the name of Cuvier earlier, and he was the guy who, like I said, kind of brought forth this and kind of mainstreamed the idea that maybe it wasn't like this. Maybe those volcanoes, maybe those earthquakes, maybe this tectonic activity that we observe today has always been happening, and it's just been happening for a lot longer than we think it has been. And so rather than, you know, these handful of huge catastrophes happening that formed everything on Earth, maybe it's, you know, kind of like your micro versus macro evolution comparison there, where, yeah, it's just been small changes that have been aggregating for millions and millions, and what we now understand to be billions of years. Because that's another thing that's kind of funny, is you go back and you look over this stuff and seeing like what the when you do have these initial like old Earth people like trying to estimate how old the Earth is with all their various methods, because, you know, they don't have things like radiometric dating methods to actually like figure out how old a rock really is. They're just looking at, you know, the stratigraphy of rocks and like guessing basically, like, yeah, that layer looks like it's 10,000 years old, I don't know. And so you see this like huge range of time that people are guessing, where there's some people that are like, yeah, it's not 6,000 years old, it's actually 100,000. And then, you know, you get people that are up to, you know, 100 million or so. And I don't know who the first people were that were saying like, no, it's like billions. I know a lot of the like early radiometric stuff that like established it as being in that like 4+ billion age was happening in Australia, I know, but I don't know what the time frame for that was. I don't know how long I have to wait before I put another layer on top of this. Yeah, and going back to Marianing for a little bit here, so one of the things that I thought was funny about this, we briefly talked about this with Lee's, when Lee was reading it yesterday, one of the things that I thought was kind of funny is that they call the book Dinosaur Lady, but not a single thing that she finds over the course of the book is actually a dinosaur. The Ichthyosaurs aren't dinosaurs, the Plesiosaur's not a dinosaur, the Ammonite's not a dinosaur. Like, none of this, the pterosaurs aren't dinosaurs. They are all, you know, aquatic, well, they're all big reptiles that existed at the same time as dinosaurs and are, you know, close-ishly related to dinosaurs, but not what we would consider to be dinosaurs.
What defines a dinosaur?
It's an interesting question. Like, the real answer to this is always like a level of genetic similarity to other things that we consider dinosaurs, basically. As far as like the physical traits that we really closely associate with dinosaurs, the biggest thing that is like kind of a really defining physical trait of a dinosaur is the way that the legs are positioned. So they are unique among reptiles in that their legs are positioned underneath their body rather than out to the sides. So, you know, you can think about how like a crocodile has its legs. It kind of looks like it's doing push-ups all the time whenever it's moving around. Dinosaurs don't have that. You can see like with our Spinosaur here, they're underneath. It can walk upright. And that's true for all dinosaurs, as far as I know. And so that's like kind of the defining physical trait of a dinosaur. And there's things that are very closely related to dinosaurs too. Like I talked about the crocodilians. There's this group called the Archosaurs, basically, that are dinosaurs are a part of this group, but includes things like plesiosaurs and things like I think pterosaurs are Archosaurs too. The crocodilians are Archosaurs. And so I think we'll try and do another coat here. We'll see how it goes. If it goes bad, like I said, it's part of the idea. Yeah, the question is, what color do I want to make the eye on my dinosaur here? I wonder, you want to do a quick Google image search for me? And can you tell me what color a crocodile's eyes are? I want to say like yellowish. And again, like I said, I'm kind of basing my paint job here on kind of a crocodilian. Yeah.
It's sort of like a yellowish green, kind of.
Alright, we'll go with this. And if you decide that you want to make a dinosaur as well, like I said, we still have sign-ups available. You can either call us at the front desk and just say you want to sign up, or you can come and visit us in person and tell whoever's at the front desk. We just have a clipboard up there that we're keeping track of all the folks on. I think it's $15, and I think there are, is it 15 or 20 slots total that we're offering, and like I said, quite a few of them have been filled actually, but there's still some left. Let's do a little eye spot there. And I assume there's a reason that crocodilians have yellow eyes. Presumably it helps them see underwater somehow or another. Like I said, it's kind of a weird thing with humans that there's a lot of diversity in our eye color. You tend not to see that with a lot of stuff. Kind of a uniquely mammalian thing that I have never looked into, so I'm not going to really speculate on it too much. So the other thing that obviously we can talk a little bit about here is dinosaur coloration. And so what's kind of interesting to think about is, you know, there's obviously no like soft tissue that we have of dinosaurs that is like well preserved enough to, that looks kind of bad, but that's okay.
That looks good on camera.
Yeah, that's all we need. As long as it looks good from 6 feet away, we're fine. Is that we don't really have a great way of like knowing what color or what kind of patterns these dinosaurs had on them. The fins on the Spinosaurs are something that has been, the purpose of it has been speculated for as long as we've known about this creature, and even other like finned big reptiles from, you know, prehistoric times. Dimetrodons are another great example of a big finned reptile from before this, older than this. They're like a Triassic period thing. That has a big fin on the back. Another thing that a lot of people assume is a dinosaur, but isn't, Dimetrodons. And for a long time, it was thought that the fin was like a heat thing, like they could use it to like absorb sunlight, and it would help them as far as like being energized. And you could also use it to diffuse heat, kind of like an elephant ear type of thing, where it's just a bunch of surface area for absorbing sunlight, or like I said, you go and stand in the wind and it diffuses heat off of you. Nowadays, typically what you see as far as people kind of speculating on what these types of fins were for, you tend to see it more as like the more common models, that it's like a display thing more than anything. Which, who's to say? In particular, you see it a lot. The comparison a lot of people make is to modern day birds, because obviously, you know, especially when you're talking about a theropod like a like a Spinosaur here, you know, birds are descended from stuff like this. And so there's a lot of question marks out there about, you know, what color these things are and, you know, the featheriness of different species. And like I said, you got a lot of birds out there that will have, you know, display plumage, stuff that's not there strictly for camouflage, just there for the sake of, you know, appealing to a mate and being sexually selected for. Particularly, you'll see the males do this. This is why you have, like, you know, the classic one you see around here are like the mallard ducks, where the males have this kind of showy green head and the females are brown. The females probably have a much better survivability rate because they're much better camouflage than the males do. But part of the way that the females select a mate is by the coloration of the male. And so the males get selected for something that probably isn't great for them as far as like surviving to adulthood, but makes them more likely to reproduce once they get there. And so it's not completely outside of, you know, reasonability that, you know, you would see something similar with dinosaurs where you would have what we would call sexual dimorphism between them as far as like the coloration. Another thing that could potentially be a purpose for something like this would be display thing for territories or display for kind of warding off predators. So a good example of something like this that you could see at the Science Center is our bearded dragon. When he's feeling a little threatened or feeling a little amped up, you'll see him puff his beard out and it'll turn black. He'll do a color change that's meant to, you know, ward off whatever is potentially threatening him. And so I think I'm going to use a little bit more of that yellow just so I'm not cracking open a million different paints here. And I think we'll do some of this kind of goldish color, and then we'll crack open one more. Maybe we'll do like a red or something like that. Red's a really easy color that you'll see a lot of animals kind of have, because like all you gotta do is kind of flush the thing with blood and it turns red. So why don't we try kind of maybe do kind of a stripy pattern here. Like I said, we'll kind of go with this is meant to be sort of a display thing, kind of model for what the fin is for. Like I said, I actually really like the idea of it as like a heating thing. I think that's really cool. And like I said, it was kind of the very prevalent model, you know, not super long ago, but like I said, science has kind of gotten away from it, so you know, my black paint's not quite dry on there though. Might have to wait a little bit on this one. But I think I'm gonna keep sitting in here and painting. I have no idea how long I've been talking for. It seems like probably a long time. Almost 40 minutes, perfect. I knew this was gonna be a long one coming into it. I'm not upset about it. But if you are interested in doing the dinosaur painting, like I said, this one that I'm making is going to be one of the example ones that Carl has there when he's hosting it. The one you get won't be quite this big. It'll be a little bit smaller one. So I think it's $15 to come in and do it, and we'll provide you the dinosaur, provide you brushes, paint, all that to do it. And like I said, I think the plan, at least for now, is to do one of them a month. We just got a new 3D printer that we also debuted in one of these shows not too long ago. And so we're now going to be 3D printing our own critters, and like I said, we'll be doing these painting things, I think, once a month. So if you think that's interesting, I can give you maybe a little sneak peek and say that the one that we have planned for November is also not a dinosaur. It is, in fact, a prehistoric critter that is not a dinosaur, so I'm not going to completely reveal it, but I'll give you a little teaser there. We've found a model and we're printing them as we speak. But otherwise, if you just want to come in and visit the Science Center, we are open 7 days a week. We are open Monday through Saturday from 9:30 to 5. And we are open Sundays from 1 to 5, so come by after lunch on Sundays. And if you're somebody who maybe is a little leery about coming to the Science Center because you're a little worried about, you know, being in close contact with a bunch of people, I gotta say the fall is generally the best time to come in. It's our slowest period, so if you're somebody who's a little iffy on like, oh, do I want to be out and be around a bunch of people right now? Now is the time to come and visit us. There'll be times during the course of the week that we are completely empty. You can be the only person in here. And if you happen to come by at 3:30, a lot of times we'll be doing these shows out on the main exhibit floor. We'll do them as a live show, and any guests who want to wander in are welcome to wander in. I'm doing this one in the back right now, kind of away from the guests, because it's kind of a weird, atypical one where I'm making a big old mess and just kind of chatting at the camera here. Not the most exciting live experience, probably. But like I said, if you happen to come in and it's around 3:30 and you notice we're doing one of these shows, we're more often than not very happy to let you come in and watch, if not actively participate even. But anyway, like I said, come in and visit us anytime we're open. Tomorrow, what's tomorrow? Friday? Yeah. There'll probably be some other dinosaur thing. Are you on tomorrow? No, probably Angie on tomorrow. Or maybe me, who knows? We don't know what's happening yet tomorrow, but it'll be a show and it'll probably be about dinosaurs. And like I said, if you think this is interesting, or if you don't think this is interesting, tune in a different day. We'll be talking about something else, but it'll be kind of in the same vein. A lot of times, like I said, they're a little bit more active, a little bit more kind of activity-centric. But like I said, keep tuning in. You'll see different educators talking about all kinds of different topics. Like I said, we kind of been doing like theme week-ishes, theme half weeks for a while now. So like I said, if you're not into dinosaurs, tune in next week, and actually next week's also going to be about dinosaurs. But the week after that, tune back in and it will be about something else. Anyway, thank you for watching, and we will see you tomorrow.